So hello everyone who's tuning in. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amanda Woomer, and I run the website, blog, social media of Spook Eats. I have written several books on haunted hospitality and travel books. And then I've also really started focusing on the feminine side of the paranormal lately. Most notably the feminine macabre, which actually has several people here this weekend included, obviously Vanessa, Courtney, who you'll be seeing later, and Alex, who you'll be seeing tomorrow. I think that's everyone. If I forgot anyone, I apologize. I really like to look at haunted history from the perspective of the feminine. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics. It always gets a couple of people clutching their pearls and raising their eyebrows, but it's Harlots and Hauntings. So quick, cheap plug really fast. This is going to be loosely based off of my latest book, Harlots and Hauntings. It just came out in June. So like the title suggests, it is kind of suggestive in the content material. So ye be warned. I have watered it down a bit for YouTube. So no pictures of boobies, nothing too graphic, nothing too bad. But if you're intrigued with what I'm talking about and you would like to see the more risque version, I do recommend picking up a copy of Harlots and Hauntings. Basically, this talk, before I get too into it, is really about the importance of narrative and how it is always kind of manipulated to benefit the conqueror, the majority, the ones in power. So when we're investigating the paranormal and particularly going to haunted locations, particularly haunted locations that kind of have a stigma surrounding it, whether it's a former brothel or an orphanage, a jail, a former insane asylum, things like that, it's really important to separate history from the ghost stories. And same thing that we'll see today talking about Harlots and Hauntings. The first half, I'll be kind of dispelling some myths surrounding the history of sex work and sex workers' stories. And then the second half, we're going to be looking at 3 locations that are haunted by femme phantoms of negotiable affections. So without further ado, prostitution. As everyone says, it is the world's oldest profession. That is what everyone says whenever I talk about this book and my research into the history of sex work. And while that is a very poetic way to look at sex work and prostitution, it's actually not the world's oldest profession. This is a term that was coined by Rudyard Kipling in 1898 in his story On the City Wall. He was describing one of his characters' jobs, and that's how he described it, that she worked in the world's oldest profession and she was a prostitute. And yet, for whatever reason, despite the fact that this is a work of fiction by a very well-known writer, it's been accepted as a historic fact. Here we are over 100 years later, and people still say, oh, prostitution, it's the world's oldest profession. So we can see, even at the very base of when we look at the history of sex work, it already gets off on the wrong foot because it's not the world's oldest profession. Surely things like farming, butchers, tailors, builders, all of those professions kind of went directly towards establishing civilization as we know it. You go from nomadic to actually settled and civilized. And while sex work didn't have a hand in that, things like farmers and tailors and butchers did have a hand in that. However, there's no denying that it's certainly an ancient profession, and sex has been traded for goods and services for centuries now. So I will not take that away from sex work. So sex among the ancients, this is something that we've seen really for millennia now. And the very first surviving text that mentions sex work is actually in the Epic of Gilgamesh. If you were an anthropology major in college, like I was, you might have had to read this. I did, and it was slightly mind-numbing. But basically, for those of you who did not read the story, it tells the story of Gilgamesh, who is half god, half man. He's a tyrannical ruler. He's very cruel. And his people call to the gods for help. And in response, they create the man Enkidu. Now, Enkidu is a wild man. He runs around naked. He sleeps in the dirt. He eats raw meat. Certainly not, the sort of competition for someone like Gilgamesh. So the temple priestess Shamat is sent to Enkidu, and through sex work and teaching him kind of the ways of men and women, Shamat civilizes Enkidu. And then he goes on to confront Gilgamesh. They become bros and they go off on adventures. So it's very clear that without Shamat, you would not have the Epic of Gilgamesh. And yet, in 1876, when the Epic of Gilgamesh was being translated for the very first time by a man named George Smith, he was flabbergasted with how promiscuous this was, and these lines that explained the acts that Shamat did for Enkidu in order to civilize him. So George Smith actually completely wiped out Shamat in the original translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh. She is nowhere to be found, and it wipes out the importance of her and her role in this story. Luckily for us, in 1911, another translation came about and Shamat was reinserted back into the narrative. But you see very early on, one of the oldest texts, and the very first translation of that text tries to manipulate and censor a sex worker. So I find that very interesting that some things never change. And Shamat is interesting because she is one of the first examples of a woman bridging the gap between sexuality and spirituality. But she's obviously not the last. Sacred prostitution, or temple prostitution as it was known as sometimes, was very common all throughout the ancient world. We see it in Greece, we see it in Rome and India, Japan. We even see it among the Aztec and Incan civilizations. So this is worldwide. We see these women that they work at temples, and sexual acts are seen as an act of devotion. They're seen as a way to honor a deity, and it's seen as something very beautiful. A great example of sex in the ancient world is the Greek creation myth. If you haven't read that, it's a doozy, highly recommend it. But it just shows that the ancients were not prudish in any way. They definitely openly talked about sex and sex workers. In fact, in Greece, both men and women were able to work in the temple of Aphrodite, serving Aphrodite, and their sexual acts were seen as both sacrifices and acts of devotion for Aphrodite. So it was an equal opportunity for men and women in Greece. And then we fast forward to Rome, where you start to see a little bit of a shift where prostitution itself is readily available, it's readily accepted. Men higher up in society were permitted to engage in sex with men and women, as long as they didn't enjoy it too much. That was the parameter. That was the only rule that they had. You couldn't enjoy it too much. So while prostitution was readily accepted, prostitutes themselves were not. Many times prostitutes were formerly enslaved people, criminals who were being punished for a crime, or they were women many times that were just living on the fringe of society and had no other way to support themselves. So we start to see that shift, and especially as Christianity starts to spread through the area, where prostitution is okay, but the prostitutes themselves are not. And we continue to see this divide as Christianity spreads between the lower class and the upper class sex workers. The lower class workers, they're working on the streets. Sometimes they're working out of cribs, as they'll be known, or brothels. And they're the ones that are targeted by the authorities and by rules and regulation. They're harassed, and they're the ones that experience violence. Whereas on the other side, we see the upper class prostitutes that are able to work for and have relationships with wealthy men, sometimes kings, sometimes popes. And that is okay. It's almost expected that the upper class gentlemen take a mistress. So that leads me to one of my favorite topics, is the courtesans, as they're known. And these are basically just very fancy prostitutes. They work for very wealthy benefactors, and they have relationships with them and really benefit from them. So the idea of the courtesan is not exclusive to Renaissance Europe. I think that's what most people think of. It's actually a very ancient practice. It dates back to the 5th century BCE. And we see it in China, Japan, India, Greece, and Rome. So it's a very ancient practice that continued through the Renaissance era and even into the 18th and 19th centuries. So around this time of the Reformation, the Renaissance, the continued spread of Christianity throughout Europe, this hatred towards sex workers really starts to take off. Not only are they kind of looked down upon and shunned like they were in ancient Rome and throughout the Middle Ages, but now they're specifically being targeted as sinners. And Martin Luther himself was actually known to call them murderers, and that these women should be flayed and tortured and punished for what they're doing. So very intense emotions towards these women. But again, it was the women in the brothels and on the streets that were being targeted, not the women that were with kings and popes. And that's another separation we start to see with the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church splitting. Protestants do not like prostitutes at all. They see them as really the root of all evil, the sin. And the Catholics more so see it as, well, prostitution is a necessary evil to keep off the worser evils, such as, rape, incest, and clutch the pearls, homosexuality. But there is that very different opinion on prostitutes and their roles within society. Obviously, the Catholic Church, they actually benefited off of prostitution in many areas, and many popes were known to have courtesans themselves. Clearly, things have changed, but so the role of a royal mistress was very, very common throughout courts in France, Russia, Prussia, Romania, Sweden, England. And it was not just permitted, but it was expected. A royal mistress was expected to be a role fulfilled in court. Interestingly enough, there was one king, I believe he was from Prussia, and I love this story, that he actually genuinely loved his wife. So he named a woman as his royal mistress, but then he never slept with her. He never had any sort of relationship with her. She just kind of got all the benefits without having to do any of the work, having to deal with the king, because he actually loved his wife. However, the majority of kings and queens at this time lived very separate lives. They did not marry for love or sex. Many times it was to maintain familial ties, politics, money. So these people lived very separate lives. The queen had her affairs and the king had his affairs. And again, royal mistresses were very, very common, and again, expected. So a lot of times people think courtesans were really just a pretty face, some arm candy for the king, a beautiful woman to kind of, beef up your court. But in fact, many of these women were very well traveled, usually even better traveled than upper class women of society. They were well spoken. You had to be witty and charming to want these men to spend time with you and to pay you for your time and your company. They were well dressed, but they also were heavily involved in politics. Many times the courtesans and the royal mistresses had a lot of say in politics. A lot of times they had the ear of the king, and they had a lot of sway and influence over the king. So they weren't just pretty faces. A lot of times they were very powerful and very influential within the court. So I have several courtesans up here on the screen for you to kind of get to know. Some of them you might recognize. If you don't recognize their faces, you might recognize some of their names. We'll see. This is me going to attempt to speak Italian and French, neither of which I do. So if I butcher these names, bear with me. So the first we have on the upper left side, this is a portrait painted by Raphael, and it is believed to be a portrait of Giulia Farnese. my Italian for you. But she was the mistress of Pope Alexander VI around 1505. So this is a great example of a pope, the pinnacle of power and control of the Catholic Church, benefiting from sex work at the time, and enjoying a young woman named Julia. So she was dubbed both the Pope's whore and, ironically, it was used as an insult, the Bride of Christ. So she was not particularly popular among those around her. But by the time she was 25 years old, Pope Alexander kind of got tired of her and sent her on her way. Sounds like Leonardo DiCaprio, but whatever. So it's interesting that she would be immortalized in a Raphael portrait, absolutely stunning painting of this young woman, who by the time she was 25, unfortunately, she was an old maid. Yay. Yay, history. So then in the middle, the top middle, we have a beautiful lady. I'm going to pronounce her name wrong, probably. Rosalie Doucet. That's my French. And she was a very, very well-known and successful 18th century companion for both French nobility and French kings. She's also a very well documented courtesan, because she was the subject of so many portraits. Just looking at her, she is very beautiful. She is very stunning, especially in the 18th century style with the white powdered wig. So she sat for many portraits of herself, and then she was also the subject of many paintings as well. Interestingly, one of my favorite fun facts that I have is that Rosalie, unfortunately, I don't know why this would be her claim to fame, it's terrible, but she is the first officially documented dumb blonde. Poor Rosalie. Then the last one on the top row on the right-hand side, you might recognize her from her fancy necklace with a bee with some pearls hanging from it. But this is Anne Boleyn. So this is King Henry VIII's second wife. She's the reason why he split from Rome in order to start his own church so he could divorce his wife and remarry Anne. Unfortunately, she's most notably remembered for her beheading in 1536. But prior to that, she was one of Henry's mistresses, one of his royal mistresses. So she was unfortunately not very popular. Her nickname was the King's Whore. So you can imagine how, the complete annihilation of the religious front in England was shifted for her, which might have caused a little bit of turmoil for some people, and they certainly did not like her. And eventually she was sadly executed, again in 1536. The bottom two we have, these are ladies that were royal mistresses for the same man, and that would be King Charles II. If you know your British royal history, you would know that King Charles II was known as the Merry Monarch. So he liked good food, he liked good drinks, and he loved beautiful women. He had many, many mistresses. I believe he had 12 illegitimate children with 7 of his mistresses. So he had more than 7 mistresses, but these are just 2 of them. So the bottom left-hand side, this is Barbara Palmer. So she was hands down Charles's most powerful mistress. She had so much influence and sway over him that her nickname was significantly better than the King's Whore. She was dubbed the Uncrowned Queen. So that just shows you how much power that she had within Charles's court. Absolutely amazing. I love that that is her nickname. And then the final one we have on the bottom right-hand side is Nell Gwyn. Now, where Barbara Palmer was the most powerful of the queens, or of the of the royal mistresses, Nell was the most popular. She was known as Pretty Witty Nell, and she was a former actress, a former prostitute, and she really rose up the ranks to become one of the most successful royal mistresses out there. So like I said, royal mistresses and courtesans in general really continued into the 18th and 19th century. But I do think for many of us, when we think of prostitution in the 19th century, the narrative definitely shifts from these women in power to those working on the streets, cobblestone streets, fog, gaslit lanterns, a carriage going by, and a lot of hardship as well. So by the 19th century, sex workers were no longer seen as sinners that needed to be punished like they did during the Reformation, but they were seen as victims that needed to be pitied and helped. So society had one way of helping them, and then the government had another, neither of which really worked out. Shock, shock. So society really started to create these charities that were meant to help these women, to really help them reform themselves, reform their lives, and get back on their feet and be honest once again. They were there to help the fallen women, as they were known. So some of the names that I have of these charities, I don't have them memorized because they're long-winded and obnoxious. Some of these names are called the Marylebone Female Protection Society, the Glasgow Midnight Rescue Brigade, and the London Society for the Rescue of Fallen Women. Now, these charities only wanted a very specific demographic. They wanted young women, women without venereal diseases, without children, and those that seemed very downtrodden and beaten down, because they were more likely to be a success story. So they only wanted to help a certain type of person, but these charities were very popular, especially in the higher ends of society. It's believed that Charles Dickens was a huge fan of these charities, and you all know how I feel about Charles Dickens, so we'll just leave it at that. But so that was how society tried to help. The way the government tried to help was a series of laws called the Contagious Diseases Acts. These were very controversial, and they were passed between 1864 and 1869. And basically, it mandated that any woman that was suspected of sex work would be forced to undergo mandated exams, physical exams. Didn't matter if there was any proof, any evidence, any reason why. If the police stopped you, you had to do it. If you ran, you went to jail. If you resisted, you went to jail. So these mandated exams really targeted lower class women, and were described as surgical rape. It was horrifying for these women, and society as a whole. Eventually, through the work of social workers and early feminists, these laws were repealed, luckily. And in 1886, I believe, is when they were finally abolished. Right around the same time when the age of consent was raised from 12 years old to 14 years old. We're making headway, I guess. I don't know. So 1886 is when sex work really made headlining news with the abolishment of these controversial laws. Several years later, sex work would make headlining news once again. And this would be in the Jack the Ripper murders. As we look at history, we're always told that the victims of Jack the Ripper were prostitutes. They were all prostitutes, kind of living on the fringe of society, living dangerous lives in the wrong place, at the wrong time, soliciting the wrong man. And we're starting to realize that that's not true. Again, we're seeing that narrative has been twisted and manipulated to make ourselves feel better, when in truth, it's not entirely accurate. So in the Jack the Ripper murders, if you're unfamiliar with them, I don't know how you could be, but in case you are, they occurred in the Whitechapel neighborhood of East London during the Autumn of Terror in 1888. And we have the canonical five. Those are the five victims that have been accepted as Jack the Ripper's victims. So we have Mary Ann Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and then Mary Jane Kelly. And again, we've always been taught that these five women were prostitutes, and that's why they were targeted by Jack the Ripper. In truth, only two of the women targeted by Jack the Ripper were actually working as prostitutes, Elizabeth Stride and Mary Jane Kelly. The other three women, they were homeless, they were living with men out of wedlock. They had odd jobs like selling flowers, crocheting, cleaning, things like that. But they were not prostitutes. And one of the reasons why many ripperologists and historians think that this has kind of become the narrative is the concept of using the word prostitute as a way to create a barrier between us and them. If we can dehumanize them in a way by labeling them as something undesirable, then it's easier for us to look at the autopsy photos, the crime scene photos, read the coroner's report, because it really is very gruesome and grisly what these women experienced. But I do think it's important to note that not all of them were targeted because they were prostitutes. They were targeted because they were women, again, in the wrong place at the wrong time, possibly alone, possibly intoxicated. So they were seen as vulnerable, and easy targets in a way. So again, this is really important to kind of shift our way of thinking and shift our narrative, when we look at even famous cases like Jack the Ripper. And then violence against sex workers, unfortunately, I mean, I would say it continued into the 20th century, but it continues into the 21st century as well. So as the 20th century progressed, things really didn't get much better for sex workers. So there was a lot of stigma surrounding sex work throughout the 20th century, particularly within the two world wars. During World War I, the US and Britain taught abstinence in their military bases. Obviously, that did not work, despite the fact that they painted women as, disease-ridden and spies. And come World War II, they were good time gals and fast women. When men are far away from home, possibly preparing to die the next day, they're probably going to go to the brothel. So by World War II, they changed their tune, started educating their soldiers, giving them condoms, giving them sex education. But they still always put the blame on the women. They always painted them as the enemy. In this picture I have here, this is an actual propaganda poster from the 1940s. And it says, "She may look clean, but pickups, good time girls, and prostitutes spread syphilis and gonorrhea. You can't beat the Axis if you get the VD." So again, it's painting the women as the ones that are responsible and not realizing it takes two to tango. But in both world wars, women were forced to work in military brothels on both sides. So there's no good side versus the bad side when it comes to forcing women to work in these situations and work in these environments. Many times these women comforted the soldiers before a battle, especially World War I. If you think about it, these were young men, many of them boys, let's be honest. So in this case, many of them were virgins. So not only was this the last time they would be with a woman, but it would be the first time as well. And there are reports of brothels overflowing with soldiers on the eve of a battle where they knew they were going to die. So these women boosted morale, offered comfort, and not just in the world wars. We see this dating back to the American Revolution, the Civil War, and throughout, where women act as morale boosters for men. And it comes off as intentionally forgotten, I feel. The work that these women did and the sacrifice that they made, many of them did not want to be in these situations. So the sacrifice that they made is forgotten, and intentionally so. I do think that the ideal 20th century war hero, the Captain America, if you will, is not a prostitute. And at the end of the wars, both in America and in Europe, we see that shift towards family life. People, they're marrying, they're having kids, they're building houses, they're settling down. So there's that focus on the family unit. So the stigma against prostitution only just magnifies, because it's seen as the outside trying to attack the perfect ideal family home. And again, that's a stigma that still exists even today in 2022. We're no better than mid 20th century. So with that being said, I do think that it's important to share these women's stories and to really shine a light on it. Whether it's dark and grisly, it's dirty, it makes us uncomfortable, I think it's a history that we need to discuss. Many of these women were unknowns, they were undesirables, and all throughout history, the work of sex workers and the lives of sex workers has gone relatively unknown. What we do know is from the perspective of a man, usually men who are trying to control them or solicit them. And I would argue that sex work has boosted economies. They've built empires, boosted morale in wars. And for many women, they were able to find autonomy in sex work, build up enough money to open their own establishments, their own businesses, help run towns and donate to charities. So it's definitely a stigma that's starting to chip away, I hope. Again, many of these women were nameless blips throughout history, intentionally forgotten. They're intentionally nameless. And I'm thrilled to be able to share with you 3 ladies that have chosen to haunt. And because they've chosen to haunt their former places of employment, they're not nameless blips. They're not forgotten. Many of these locations are sharing their stories, sharing their saying their names, and offering these women fame and notoriety and compassion that they may have been denied in death. So without further ado, first I want to introduce Lydia to you. Now, Lydia is very special to me. The very first time I was interviewing Corey, the curator for the Brothel Museum here at the Red Onion Saloon, we got an EVP. It was amazing. We were doing a Skype session. I was recording. As I was going through weeks later, editing out me saying like and because I say it a lot. I know I do. I caught an EVP. We got Lydia's voice. So this has a very special place in my heart. So Lydia is the eternal resident of the Red Onion Saloon in Skagway, Alaska. Now, Skagway was really the gateway to the Klondike gold fields. So by 1898, it was the largest town in Alaska with about 15,000 inhabitants and thousands more coming and going every single day. It was definitely a rough area. It was described as a little better than hell on earth. So definitely rough and tumble sort of mining town. And it's believed that it would cost about $6 a day to live in Skagway. But a woman doing honest work could only make about $3 a day. So that really forced women to get creative. And in many cases, they turned to prostitution because it was very lucrative and they were able to maintain a lifestyle. So the Red Onion Saloon opened in 1898, and it was the swankiest dance hall, the most exclusive brothel. It was really a great place to work in Skagway. So the Red Onion worked on a doll system, which is actually very interesting. I haven't seen it anywhere else, but basically behind the bar, there would be 10 rag dolls that looked like each of the women working upstairs. And if she was sitting up, she would be available. And if she was lying on her back, she was currently indisposed. So that's really unique to the Red Onion Saloon. And Lydia came to Skagway and eventually came to work at the Red Onion Saloon. So Lydia arrived right around this time, around 1898. And we know that she arrived in Skagway with a male relative. We don't know if it was a brother, an uncle, a husband, a father, someone arrived with her. He left her in Skagway with some money. He went off into the gold fields and he never returned. So eventually, unfortunately, Lydia ran out of money. And the only way she was able to make a living was by resorting to prostitution. So she ended up working at the Red Onion Saloon for a while. Unfortunately, she ended up contracting syphilis. The madam ended up branding her face to let people know that she was sick. And Lydia eventually committed suicide, unfortunately. Despite though her tragic life, her afterlife of sorts is very happy and jovial and a little mischievous. The people at the Red Onion Saloon claim that if they don't talk about Lydia enough or they don't say hello to her in the morning, Lydia gets a little bit mischievous. She plays tricks, maybe makes a few bangs, hides some things. One thing that likes to move around a lot is an antique bra, and they think that that is Lydia causing some mischief. And she is seen both upstairs and downstairs. So the people at the Red Onion Saloon really think that Lydia is enjoying the notoriety that she's been given. And when people talk about her, she seems to really appreciate it and enjoy it. So that is a story that's, for whatever reason, I feel very connected to Lydia and the Red Onion Saloon. I've never been myself. Hopefully someday, if Alaska wasn't so far away from New York. Up next, we have Nina. not Nina, Nina. So Nina is said to haunt the Old Town Pizza and Brewing Company in Portland, Oregon. And Old Town is the oldest town, shock, shock, of Portland, Oregon. And this was also known as Whitechapel, Portland's Whitechapel. So similarly to the Whitechapel in London, it was rife with poverty, violence, and prostitution. During the peak of prostitution in Portland between 1902 and 1905, it was believed between 500 and 2,000 prostitutes were living and working in the area. So as usual, similar to Skagway in Portland, it cost about $10. No, sorry. Acceptable jobs only paid about $10 a week altogether. So Skagway cost about $6 a day. Portland was similar. It wasn't exact, but it was similar. So women making only $10 a week could not maintain a lifestyle in Old Town. So many of them did resort to prostitution. One woman, she was very popular, and she was described as, I love this description, bright, attractive, and most cleanly. And she made about $5,700 in 1911. Today, that's $175,000. So if you were lucky, it was very lucrative. However, unfortunately, Nina was not one of the lucky ones. So the story goes that Nina was an indigenous woman that was sold into Portland's sex industry. She did not want to be there. She was not there of her own volition. And a group of missionaries ended up finding her and offered her her freedom in exchange for information on Portland's sex industry. She agreed, but before she could give any information or escape, she mysteriously fell down an elevator shaft. And that is how she unfortunately passed away. Today, Old Town Pizza and Brewing Company has changed the elevator shaft to be a dining booth. And that's the photo I have here. This is the dining booth where Nina died. So a little morbid, but some people are into that sort of thing. So Old Town Pizza and Brewing is supposedly built on top of the Shanghai Tunnel. So that's another little bit of, spooky history. And it's currently a pizza place, of all things. They actually have a pizza in honor of Nina called the Ghost Pie. And people have spotted Nina wandering through the dining hall, dressed in a black dress. They smell lavender. And the place has really embraced her, and they talk about her, and obviously they made a pizza for her. So it's another way that these locations continue to keep these women's spirits alive, for lack of a better term. That was a little too punny for me. Last but not least, sorry, I just bumped my table and it shook the whole place, earthquake, is Virginia. So this is over in the UK. And she is found in the White Swan Hotel in Henley in Arden, Warwickshire. That was my attempt at Richard S. Stepp's British accent. It was very bad, I know. So England has a very long history of prostitution. If you do get a copy of Harlots and Hauntings, you'll read up on the Middle Ages topic that I definitely hopped over with this presentation. But the very first evidence of prostitution was actually a brothel token from ancient Roman times that was found in the River Thames. So it has a very long history. During the Middle Ages, the Bishop of Winchester, who was obviously a member of the Catholic Church, actually ran brothels outside of London. So the Catholic Church directly benefited off of sex work, despite the fact that prostitutes were sinners. When King Henry VIII separated from Rome, he took over all of the church's lands and property, including those brothels, which he shut down. After that, prostitution was kind of tolerated, but not really embraced, accepted. And then, like I mentioned earlier, come the 19th century, with the spread of evangelical Protestantism, they started to see them as the victims that needed to be saved. So around that time, we have Virginia, who was, again, at the White Swan Hotel. So the White Swan Hotel, supposedly an inn, has been at this location since 1352. Which that's very old from American standards. But the structure that we see here in the image was built between 1550 and 1565. So it's not that old. It's only 500 years old, 400, 500 years old. So Virginia Black is said to have worked in Henley and Arden, supposedly out of the White Swan Hotel, when she was about 18 years old in the year 1845. Around this time, she got into an argument with a gentleman inside this building. She was standing at the top of a staircase and they got into an argument. We don't know if he was her employer or a lover, a relative, but they got into an argument and she ended up dying on the staircase. Whether she fell and tripped or if she was pushed, we don't know. But for the longest time, she was said to haunt the White Swan Hotel outside of room 17. However, insider information has revealed that she may have moved on after an encounter with some paranormal investigators and researchers several years ago, based off of a conversation that they had. And the fact that she hasn't been spotted in recent years makes us think that Virginia may have been able to move on, for lack of a better term. She might have found that happy ending, that closure, to be able to no longer have to haunt her location. So those were just 3 ladies that are featured in Harlots and Hauntings. We have 11 altogether. So you'll also meet Eleanor and Nettie and Julia and Rosie. We've got lots of ladies. And these are all available at spookeats.com/shop. This is my cheap plug right now. So like I said, this was a very watered down version of the presentation. There was no nudity photos. There wasn't too much talk on boobies. But if you are interested in knowing a bit more about ancient times, Middle Ages, Renaissance, American Civil War, American Revolution, the World Wars, I do recommend you pick up Harlots and Hauntings. First half of the book is all about the history of sex work in the Western world. Second half is the 11 locations that you can actually travel to. They're all either restaurants, hotels, bars. You can actually visit all of them, which is what I always try to do, is make the paranormal a bit more accessible to those that are looking to find answers. So if you're interested, I do recommend it. Obviously, it's like my child, so I'm going to be like, he's great. But if you're interested, again, Harlots and Hauntings is available at spookeats.com/shop. Very hard to say. And then last but not least, if anyone is interested in following along with my spooky adventures, I am Spook Eats on all of social media. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, kind of TikTok. I'm in the geriatric unit of TikTok, but I'm trying. My website is spookeats.com, where you can find Harlots and Hauntings, as well as information on the feminine macabre and other topics as well. Speaking of the feminine macabre, we also have social media for that on Facebook and Instagram as well. Last cheap plug, I swear, submissions for the feminine macabre have opened today officially. So if you identify as female or non-binary and you're interested in submitting an article about witchcraft, tarot, hauntings, cryptids, folklore, dark history, any of that fun stuff, we'd love to have you. You can find it at spookeats.com.